Okay, welcome to this video on congruent figures. We've already talked about what congruent means. It's when we have a segment or an angle that's the exact same measure as another segment or angle. So now we're going to get into congruent figures a little deeper. So what is a congruent figure? So congruent figures are two or more figures that are the same shape and size. So as you were going through this, pause whenever you need to write down what I've written down. Okay, so what is a congruent statement? Well, this is just a statement, and you'll see that we're going to use our notation that we've been learning this year. So a statement that states that two figures are congruent. Okay, so what are corresponding parts of congruent figures? Okay, these are the parts from one figure that are congruent to the parts from another figure. Okay, and something important to know about the congruent statement is the congruent statement tells you which parts correspond. Okay, so we're going to see that in this example here. Okay, so we're told that these two triangles are congruent, right? It says triangle ABC, and we do need that triangle in front of it so we know that we're not talking about an angle, right? So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, okay? And it's telling us which parts are congruent because they're going to go in the order and they should match up. So what I'm saying is A is congruent to D. So we're going to mark A to be congruent to D. So we're going to go through and mark all of our corresponding parts here. All right, so A is congruent to D, and then because B is next on the left and E is next on the right, that means that B is congruent to E. So this time I'll give it 2 congruence marks. And then lastly, C is congruent to F. Okay, well that's all our congruent angles. We also want to mark up all the congruent sides. And we can also get that from our congruent statements. So we see that AB is congruent to DE because those letters are right next to each other and correspond, what's on the left here, AB corresponds, or the first 2 letters on the left triangle in our statement correspond to the first 2 letters on the right triangle in our statement. So let's find AB in our figure, give it a congruence mark, and then DE a congruence mark. Now we would have BC is congruent to EF, BC is congruent to EF, and now we can see in our picture that these triangles are congruent and very colorful, right? We have all the markings that show which angles are congruent to which angles and which sides are congruent to which sides. All right, let's use this to do some examples here. So use the picture to write a congruent statement if possible. So sometimes we won't know that it's congruent. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. All right, we have 2 triangles. It does look like we have a lot of markings on here, so let's make sure we have a corresponding part for each angle and side. So here I see that M is congruent to G because of the 2 congruence marks, and O is congruent to I because of the 1 congruence mark, and then Q is congruent to E because of these 3 congruence marks here. Okay, so I see that I have 3 congruent angles. Now I'm going to check for my sides. Well, MO is congruent to GI because of this 1 congruence mark on each of them. MQ is congruent to GF, 2 congruence marks. And then lastly, EI is congruent to QO because of these 3 congruence marks. So I do know the triangles are congruent, and I'm going to write my congruent statement. So when you go to do this, you can just write one of the triangles with the points in any order you want. You do need a triangle, of course, when it's 3 letters. So we have triangle. You can choose whichever to start with. I'm going to go with GEI, whatever order's fine. Okay, but then the second triangle, you need to make sure that you're writing it so that your points correspond and tell you which parts are corresponding. So again, triangle, well, G is right here. It has 2 congruence marks, so it needs to go with M. So I'm going to put in M next. And then E, well, I went from G to E, so I need to the 3 congruence marks. So now I need to go from M to Q, 3 congruence marks. And then lastly, I'm left with I, right? I went from E to I is congruent to Q to O. I'll make this Q to O right there. All right, let's try another one together. Okay, so looking for all my congruent angles, I can see that I have 1 congruence mark here and 1 here. I have 2 here and 2 here. but I have nothing here. However, these two lines form vertical angles, so I can actually conclude that these are in fact congruent, right? So I'm gonna put those on there. So now I do see that I have all of my angles congruent to an angle in each figure. I also see that I have congruent sides, right? This side is congruent to this side is congruent to this side, and this side is congruent to this side. So name the first triangle however you want. I'm going to go with the triangle on the right and call it triangle FHE, not however you want, but in whichever order you want, is congruent to triangle. Okay, well, my F goes with G, and my H goes with D, corresponds to D, and then my E is actually in both of these here, so E corresponds to E. All right, I'd like you to go ahead and pause the video and see if you can come up with the congruent statement on your own, if possible, right? Remember, you have to be sure that these are congruent figures. So pause the video, give it a try. Okay, so looking at these, first I'm going to check for all my angles. Well, I definitely have congruent angles. They're also, because they have one congruence mark, happen to be congruent to each other in the same triangle, right? So all these angles are the same. They're also all the same over here. So I could say any of these angles correspond to any of the angles in the other triangle, right? I have 3 congruent angles, and we could even build on that because we know that because the triangle sum theorem, that these 3 angles together equal 180 degrees, so they must be 60 degrees each. That is true for these. So we have congruent angles. What about the sides? Well, we can see that within the triangle, all the sides are congruent to each other, right? Within this triangle, all these sides are the same, and within this triangle, all these sides are the same. However, between the two triangles, well, we don't know this for sure, right? This one says 1 congruence mark, whereas this one says 2 congruence marks. So these could be different sizes. They could be the same, but they could be 2 different sizes. So we don't actually know that these triangles are congruent. So what we write, because it is possible that they are congruent, but we don't know for sure, what we're going to write is not enough information. Okay, the short story on this one is we do in fact have enough information, so let's just go ahead and write it. You do not need a triangle out front because they're not triangles. You don't need any special shape. I'm just going to name the first one. I'm going to call it DEFC. Okay, whatever order you did is fine. And we'll talk about how you can check to make sure that you have them in the right order. So DEFC, my D would have to go with my I. My E would have to go with my J, and my F would have to go with my K, and that leaves C with H. Okay, so you might not have these in the same order as I do, and that's fine, but you need to make sure that when whichever spot the D is in this figure on the left is the same spot the I is on the right, and the E should be in the same spot as the J, and the F to the K, and the C to the H. Okay, one more thing we're going to do here. Mark the corresponding parts and then solve for the variables. Okay, so I'm actually only going to mark the parts that we are going to use here to solve. Okay, so for instance, I can see, it's kind of small here, but I can see that I have 4x minus 5. In order to solve here, I need to find the corresponding part in the other figure and see if I have a value for it. And sometimes, depending on how the figures are placed, it can be hard to tell which parts correspond just by looking at the figure, right? There's some it's a rigid motion. They're the exact same shape and size, but they've been transformed in a few different ways, right? Sometimes it's just translated, but this looks like it might have been translated and also reflected. And that's why the congruent statement is useful. All right, so I'm going to start with G here. So looking at my congruent statement, I can see that G is the first letter. Get this so I can see it. G is the first letter, so it means it corresponds with A. So I can conclude that G and A are congruent. So I'm going to mark that they're congruent. And now I'm going to use that information to solve for the variable. Well, if they're congruent, that means they're the same measure, same angle measure. So that means that 4x minus 5 equals 35. If I solve this equation, I'm going to add 5 to both sides. I get 4x equals 40 and x equals 10. So one of my variables, x, equals 10. All right, this is a great opportunity for you to pause and give these a try on your own. Why don't you go ahead and try 5y next and see what it corresponds to in this figure right here. What does KL correspond to, and set up that equation? Go ahead and pause now. All right, so KL are the last two letters here, so it goes with EF. So here's my EF, here's my KL. Those are my corresponding parts. I marked them, and now I'm going to write the equation, solve my equation, and y equals 2. Okay, this one was kind of set up so it's not too difficult, right? Because we're only given side lengths that we're going to use, except maybe for this one, right? You can see that that doesn't get used for anything. Sometimes it's going to be a little more challenging where you'll be given multiple side lengths and you'll have to figure out which one you need to use to solve. All right, that's our video on congruent figures. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in class.